What's poppin', Barack?
Hey, Joe, I wanted to make a Season 3 Spongebob episode tier list with you and Donald.
Okay, sounds lit, fam, but where is Donald at?
I think he's dealing with some legal stuff, but he will be here in a second.
I can't believe he was accused of 37 felonies. Crazy stuff, man.
What's up, bums?
Donald, I thought we could make a Spongebob Season 3 episode tier list together.
Yeah, that sounds cool and all, but first let's address some of the comments left on the Season 2 video. A number of people did not agree with our rating for Christmas. Who? Well, guess what? That episode is straight trash, and so are all of you.
In your face, losers. I tried to tell both of you that episode is golden, but neither of you would listen.
Donald, please do not call the commenters losers. Anyone who leaves a comment is a winner. While I personally don't care for that episode, I see why others may enjoy it. Anyway, enough about our Season 2 list. Let's get started with our Season 3 tier list. Our first episode is As Seen on TV. We are starting off with a mediocre episode, but definitely not a bad episode. In fact, I'm not sure that this season has a single bad episode.
I can think of one, but I won't spoil anything.
Thank you, Donald. Anyway, this episode is very mid-B tier in my opinion.
Barack, I would take it a step further and put this episode in C tier, maybe even D tier. This episode has a very silly moral that you should pursue your passions rather than trying to be successful in a more traditional, pragmatic sense. I think that is a silly motif to share with young children. They should be encouraged to study hard and succeed to the best of their ability in a practical role rather than a passionate one.
Donald, that is exactly why this episode is fantastic. I think it should be an A tier. The episode teaches children that so long as they can make their passion profitable, they should pursue it. That is the American dream, is it not?
Joe, the American dream is incredibly subjective. My American dream is far different from yours and Donald's.
That's fair, but I still think this is a really nice and frankly underappreciated episode.
That's a respectable opinion to have, but since Donald thinks negatively of the episode, I have to put it in B tier. Second is Born Again Crabs, another mediocre episode by early SpongeBob standards.
Barack, don't you dare call this episode mediocre again. This is one of my favorite episodes, hands down. I love the theme of not running a business like a charity. You have to put profit above everything else.
Donald, that mindset is exactly why you are the worst, most unethical president and businessman the United States has ever seen.
That's fine if you have that opinion, Joe. I'm not worried about what you think of me, you broke idiot. Born Again Crabs is a fantastic episode that should be an A tier. The conclusion is a bit dissatisfying, otherwise this episode is flawless.
I actually really like this episode for the conclusion. This is one of the most mature episodes of SpongeBob, and the writers did a great job telling a compelling story without too many gimmicks. I think A tier is the correct placement.
Third episode is Can You Spare a Dime? This episode is outstanding. We see how dynamic SpongeBob's character can be. He shows the whole emotional spectrum that humans are capable of conveying in this episode. He goes from his typical cheery self to downright enraged when Mr. Krabs will not take Squidward back. One of the best episodes ever, S tier for sure.
Barack, you are 100% correct. This episode is marvelous. Tom Kenny shows why he is one of the best voice actors in the business in this episode. I think he was genuinely pissed off the day he recorded this episode. The rage in his voice is so fierce and passionate, it is absolutely incredible. I bet Donald's favorite part of this episode is when Mr. Krabs decides not to donate to the Children's Fund. He can relate to that.
Actually, Joe, my favorite part of this episode is when SpongeBob gets so fed up with Squidward mooching off of him that he eventually snaps and yells at his beloved boss. This episode is a great allegory for why the United States cannot allow immigrants into the country. They will overstay their welcome. I considered using this episode as propaganda for my 2016 campaign, but decided against it because I did not want to risk tarnishing its good name. Absolutely stellar episode, S tier for sure.
Maybe the easiest S tier this season has to offer. Let's move on. Next on the chopping block is Chocolate with Nuts. This is the episode where SpongeBob and Patrick struggle to sell chocolate bars despite their best efforts. I struggled a little bit with this one. The green fish yelling chocolate over and over again is a worn-out gag, but overall this episode is timeless. So many hysterical moments, and the plot is relatively mature by SpongeBob standards. This is also an S-tier episode, but probably closer to the bottom of that section of the tier list.
I am with you again, Barack, but I think this might be the best episode in Season 3. Everything about this episode is great. It has several hilarious scenes, such as the green fish yelling chocolate, or the old lady fish gag, or the shady salesman faking injuries to SpongeBob and Patrick. On top of several hysterical moments, there is also a wealth of mature themes throughout this episode, such as being ethical in business and sales, and realizing that most successful businesses really were lucky, such as Spongebob and Patrick happening to find a chocolate fiend who purchased all of their products. Had it not been for this stroke of luck, they would have been unsuccessful.
Joe, I was about to be so proud of you right up until the end of your analysis. While I agree this episode is outstanding and should be an S tier, your interpretation that success in business is based solely on luck is ludicrous. Success in business depends on so many factors such as preparation, timing, strategy, hard work, and sweat, things that you softy liberals would never understand.
Donald, it is okay if you disagree. I think Joe just had a different interpretation of the episode than you did, which is fine. What is important is that we all agree this episode is a rager that belongs in S tier. Let's move on to another epic episode, Clams. When I first started watching SpongeBob, this episode was subpar, but as I matured, I grew to love this episode more and more. The episode superficially is very funny, but also has a lot of thought-provoking underlying ideas. I think the point of the episode is to show that you should not be too greedy and concerned about material possessions. Otherwise, you will get eaten by a giant clam just like Mr. Krabs.
Barack, I also think this episode is glorious. Watching Mr. Krabs slip into insanity is very entertaining from a morbidly curious perspective. I like how the writers transformed the heavy concept of overfixation and borderline addiction into a relatively light subject matter so that children could still understand that Mr. Krabs clearly had an issue, but the content was not disturbing. His obsession with his millionth dollar was obviously unhealthy, but not unsettling. Absolutely incredible episode, S tier for sure.
I agree. I used to think this episode was mediocre and probably would not have been in my top 20 as a child, but as I matured, I grew to really appreciate this episode. The writing is very mature for a children's cartoon, so a younger audience likely could not understand nor enjoy this episode. It was still funny enough and simple enough that they could enjoy it, but this was clearly meant for an older audience. Mr. Krabs' constant struggle with greed is fascinating, and this episode captures that conflict perfectly. This episode is super funny, and I think the animation is exceptional too. S tier for sure.
Glad you guys also think S tier. Let's fucking go. Up next is another good episode, but not as great as the last three, Club SpongeBob. This is the infamous Magic Conch episode. I think this episode is terrible, to be honest. I hate the Magic Conch gag. I realize this is a children's cartoon, but this episode is way too childish and mindless for my tastes. D tier for me.
Barack, I thought you were one of the more light-hearted presidents. This episode is intentionally ridiculous, as that helps build the glorious jokes scattered throughout this episode. Sure, the plot is not super intricate, but that is okay because this episode's humor helps it stand on that leg alone. Light S tier in my book.
Usually I hate episodes that are nonsensical, but Club SpongeBob is an exception. The hilarity of the Magic Conch is the irony that despite it giving the gang objectively bad advice, the conch ultimately is the best source of intelligence throughout the episode. S tier is a bit heavy for this episode, but A tier is more appropriate.
Donald, why are you pronouncing conch so weirdly?
Sorry, Joe, for whatever reason, 11 Labs seems to think the word conch should be pronounced conch, even though I spelled it correctly when typing up the script, so I have to spell it as C-A-W-N-C-H. By the way, for anyone who does not know, 11 Labs is the artificial intelligence program used to replicate mine and the other president's voice. Unfortunately, this service is not free, so it costs me money to make these videos. Please consider supporting the channel by using the affiliate links in the description below.
That's hilarious, Donald. Let's put this episode in A tier. Moving right along, our next episode is Doing Time. This is one of those episodes where the writers experiment with agnostic temporality, psychosis, and other big brain concepts. I like this episode a lot. I find it to be very thought-provoking. I also find myself morbidly curious to see how far into the pit of insanity Mrs. Puff will fall. This is an A-tier episode to me.
Barack, I agree this episode is very good. I like how the writers pulled off a relatively chaotic episode where we cannot differentiate reality from Mrs. Puff's dreams and hallucinations without getting too ridiculous. This is something they failed to do in the later seasons. I like the idea of Mrs. Puff wanting to be in prison over having to be a teacher for SpongeBob.
Donald, anything involving jail being comfortable gets your rocks off since prison is where you're going.
Joe, I would bet my children's trust fund that this whole episode makes you uncomfortable. You probably can't keep up with it, given that you need more than a 5-second attention span to comprehend it, something you are clearly lacking.
Yeah, well, at least I don't sexually assault people. Anyway, I disagree with both of you. I'm not a big fan of this episode. I think it should be in D tier. It is very confusing to follow, and I do not like that we do not know what reality is throughout the entirety of the episode, causing it to lose credibility. I also hate the ending. It is straight up corny and lame.
Joe, you're right. The ending of this episode is whack as fuck. For that alone, I'm demoting it to B tier. Let's talk about missing identity. I am ambivalent about this episode. There are a few episodes that appear late in Season 3 that are precursors for SpongeBob's falling off a steep cliff in overall entertainment value, and this episode is one of them. While the episode is not bad, I cannot enjoy it because it is too similar to the terrible new episodes. C tier, in my opinion.
Barack, don't let this episode make you anxious. It is a Season 3 episode through and through. I understand what you're saying, but believe your statement is riddled with fallacies. This episode is still pretty good, despite it potentially foreshadowing what was to come in the SpongeBob franchise. The episode is super funny, especially the scene where SpongeBob continues to eat cat food despite it clearly being revolting. I think the episode is B-tier material.
Here comes Donald with another bad opinion. This episode is objectively bad. The premise is incredibly stupid. The jokes are lacking aside from the cat food routine, and the conclusion is suboptimal. While the episode is not terrible, it is undoubtedly a precursor to the absolute garbage that Season 4 would bring us. This is a C-tier episode, maybe the worst in Season 3.
Agreed, Joe. A very good episode by newer SpongeBob standards, but not up to snuff for this tier list. Idiot Box is our next episode to discuss. Ironically, I feel like I'm in an idiot box whenever I'm on a call with you two wingnuts.
Obama, the only idiot box in this country, is the Democratic Party. Let me start by saying this episode is absolutely incredible. I remember watching this episode for the first time, and I thought to myself, wow, what an incredible episode. The jokes are hilarious, and despite the superficially childish nature of the episode, I think it actually has a very nice, accessible theme about the importance of having an imagination and not being a grouch.
Donald, believe it or not, I wholeheartedly agree with you on this. This episode is magical and iconic. I think imagination in this episode is an allegory for letting loose and having fun once in a while, a trait that everyone can benefit from having no matter how important they think they are.
Gentlemen, I agree with both of you. This is an excellent episode. My only knock on it is that the conclusion is a bit weak, but I can live with that because the other 98% of the episode absolutely kills it. This episode definitely belongs in S tier. Next episode is I Had an Accident. This is a great episode, probably not S tier, but in the higher echelon of A tier. I love the ending where a gorilla attacks SpongeBob's friends and he has to overcome his fear of the outdoors to save them. That shit has me cackling every time I watch this episode.
Barack, this episode is the fucking bomb. I love every second of it. There are so many hilarious moments we could point to. On top of that, I love the episode's theme that staying reclusive your whole life is a terrible idea. If you stay inside all the time, you will miss out on so many opportunities and experiences. S tier in my book, but I understand if you don't want it there. I guess Sleepy Joe will help us decide.
I don't really care for this episode. I hate that SpongeBob's friends did not support him when he was scared of going outside after having a very serious injury, and instead tried to peer pressure him into joining them to partake in dangerous activities that he was not comfortable with. That alone has earned this episode a C-tier ranking.
Come on, Joe, I get what you're saying, but I could easily spin your argument and counter that the point of the episode is that you should not give in to peer pressure. C-tier is way too low for this masterpiece.
Sorry, Donald, the episode is neither funny nor beneficial for society. Now that I think about it, I think D tier is a better spot.
Blasphemy!
Joe, I see your viewpoint, but cannot keep this episode out of A tier. I will put it in the lower portion of A tier to keep you happy. We have another classic in the wings with Just One Bite, the episode where Squidward finally tries a Krabby Patty. I love this episode on multiple fronts. Obviously, the episode is hilarious, but I also love the implicit theme of trying something before you decide to hate it. Easiest S tier we have gone over thus far.
Could not agree more, Barack. This episode is absolutely incredible. One underrated factor of this episode is the animation. It is absolutely gorgeous. This episode is always a joy to watch. Easy S tier.
I am in full accordance with both of you. This episode is glorious. So many incredible moments throughout just this one episode. Just because something is mainstream or you want to feel cool by hating it is not a good reason not to try something. You just might end up loving it. I think this episode is a great analogy of how the media feels about me. You see, the media represents Squidward, and I am represented by a Krabby Patty. Squidward pretends to hate me without actually knowing anything about my policies, philosophy, or accomplishments as a president that benefit him. When he finally takes a bit and learns more about me, he realizes that I am the greatest president ever.
Donald, that is ridiculous. The media hates you because you were a terrible president and a huge jackass.
Yeah, Donald, plus your pompous attitude was an easy target for late-night shows and corny comedians to get a cheap laugh at your expense.
Well, that's okay if you two feel that way, but we both know I was the best president. What matters right now, though, is that this episode belongs in S tier.
Up next is another banger, Crabborg. Let me start by apologizing to anyone who watched our Season 2 tier list. We confused this episode with Imitation Crabs. So sorry about that, everyone. Either way, Imitation Crabs definitely belonged in S tier, and this episode does too.
Barack, while I agree this is a marvelous episode, S tier is way too high. While the episode is incredibly funny, I think the asinine plot leaves a lot to be desired. Seeing SpongeBob have panic attacks over a fictitious robot gets old halfway through the episode. I think the writers were trying to send a message about mass hysteria and the foolishness of it, but they failed. That said, this is still a good episode that should be an A tier.
Donald, you are insane, bro. This episode is quintessential SpongeBob. While the episode is a bit scatterbrained and the plot is admittedly absurd, that is what adds to the hilarity of the episode. The episode is funny because of the irony of SpongeBob, along with everyone else being scared of something so silly, like Mr. Krabs turning into a robot, despite that fact that robots would not survive in the ocean. This is an S-tier episode.
I agree, Joe. S tier, but should be towards the lower end. Up next is Krabbyland. I gotta be honest, fellas, I hate this episode. Watching Mr. Krabs break the hearts of those kids is gut-wrenching, and his only punishment for doing this is having to eat lima beans. That, along with SpongeBob hurting himself to entertain others, are things I just cannot stand for. This is a D-tier episode in my mind.
Wow, Barack, I cannot believe my former boss could say something so insane. This episode should at least be an A-tier. Sure, the themes of this episode are questionable, but the fact that this episode was piquant enough to make you consider those subjects in the first place verifies that the episode is well written, even if you disagree with the morality of the writers.
Yeah, Barack, D tier is way too low for this episode. I don't think it is the best episode the season has to offer, but is a solid choice that can provide a nice break in between the more dynamite episodes. I think A tier is also a good spot for it. Love the scene where SpongeBob calls Mr. Krabs Cheapy the Cheapskate. I also think this episode has a good moral for children that being too cheap has consequences.
I guess we can stick this garbage episode in A tier. Up next is one of my favorite episodes, the Krusty Krab training video. This episode is not only hilarious, but it enlightens the audience on a lot of the lore of Mr. Krabs and the Krusty Krab. This might be the most creative episode of SpongeBob to date. It goes completely against the grain of what a typical SpongeBob episode does, and this is pulled off by the writers very effectively. S tier for sure.
Agreed, Barack. I love the experimental nature of this episode. Usually when the writers of any television show try something new, it fails miserably, but this is an exception. S tier for humor alone, while the plot is not compelling. It does not need to be because the nature of the episode is so unique.
Yeah, I like this episode too. I like how distinctive it is, but I think it should be an A tier.
Are you fucking serious, Donald? Why?
Yeah, Donald, what the hell is wrong with you?
Let me explain. The episode is unordinary, but that alone does not make it a good episode. Sure, it reveals some nifty, obscure SpongeBob lore and has a few funny moments, but that alone does not make it a top-notch episode. It is interesting to watch, and I think it is funny, but it is simply not as good as the other episodes we have in the S-tier category. It is a nice break from the traditional SpongeBob format, but as a whole, this episode is just not in the top rung.
Donald, I see your point, but I don't care. This episode is going in S tier, and that is final.
I can live with that, but it would not be there in my tier list.
Donald, you're insane, brah.
That's rich coming from a guy with dementia.
Let's debate the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes this season had to offer. I could not remember which episode was which, so I had to rewatch them for a reminder.
I know every single episode for every season by memory, and I haven't watched this show in years.
That's a lie.
Maybe so, but my memory far exceeds what yours is capable of, Sleepy Joe.
Ladies, please stop bickering at one another. Anyway, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 4 is the episode where SpongeBob shrinks the entire city with Mermaid Man's magical belt. I think this episode is really bad. The only positive thing I can say is that I like the theme of not obsessing over your heroes. I'm sure we all can relate to that, as each of us have some lunatic fanatics that would die for us. Other than that, this episode sucks. D tier.
D tier is a bit low. Barack, just because you do not like an episode does not mean it is bad. I personally also am not a big fan of this episode, but I understand why others may like it. I think B tier is a better spot for this episode. It is average, but not bad by any means. The ending where Plankton comes back to a microscopic version of Bikini Bottom is hilarious.
I think this episode is really good. I like the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes a lot. I think this episode has everything our other top-rated episodes have, numerous funny moments and a compelling plot. I would put it in A tier.
Nah, this is going in B tier towards the lower end. You are lucky Donald was generous to this episode, or it would be in C tier, Joe.
You're a buzzkill, Barack.
At least I am honest. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 5 is our other superhero episode to discuss. I think this episode is better than the last one, but still one of the weaker episodes in the Season 3 catalog. For anyone who does not remember, this is the episode where Barnacle Boy decides to join the forces of evil.
Kind of like when Donald decided to become a Republican.
Good one, Joe. I think this episode is mediocre. Probably should be in B tier.
Yep, I agree. This episode does have some funny moments, but nothing noteworthy. It is forgettable at best, but definitely not a bad episode. B tier is appropriate.
I think it should be an A tier.
Joe, why do you love the Mermaid Man episode so much? I realize you have dementia just like them, and you think of yourself as a superhero, but in reality you are just a lame old man.
I have always loved superheroes. I love all of the Marvel movies too. I think this episode is great because it has a lot of hysterical scenes, but it also teaches a great theme about respecting others. Otherwise, they may betray you or abandon you. I think the great moral of this episode earns it consideration for an A tier ranking.
Considering that this episode is mid as fuck, it is going in B tier, Joe.
At least I tried.
And failed miserably.
Up next is Midlife Crustacean. This is the episode where Mr. Krabs feels old and wants to hang out with SpongeBob and Patrick to reinvigorate his long-lost youthful energy. I think this is a top-notch episode, not quite good enough for S tier, but it should be an A tier towards the higher end.
This episode demonstrates why Sleepy Joe always wants to hang out with me and you, Barack.
Fuck you, Donald. The only reason I hang out with you guys is because you are former presidents and we can relate.
Whatever, old man, tell us how you feel about this episode.
I think it sucks. I fucking hate it.
Of course you do. It reminds you of the fact that you are a decrepit old geezer whose life is hanging on by a thread.
No, I just don't find it very funny.
Yeah, sure you don't, Sleepy Joe. Let me tell you why that is a horrendous opinion. This episode is absolutely fantastic on a number of levels. The episode is full of rib-tickling moments. And I love the overall theme that being old does not inherently make someone lame. It also implies that being quote-unquote cool is incredibly subjective, and you should do what you enjoy and not worry about how it is perceived by others. This is a definitive A-tier episode.
Good shit, Donald. A tier it is. On deck is My Pretty Seahorse. I think this episode is criminally underrated. I love the dynamic between SpongeBob's passion and Mr. Krabs' pragmatism, which is something the writers do not often explore, despite it feeling like a low-hanging fruit. I think this episode is borderline S tier.
Barack, that is a horrible take. The episode is not awful, but S tier is way too high for this second-rate episode. While I do agree the personality conflict between SpongeBob and Krabs is fascinating, the premise of the episode is preposterous. I am supposed to believe that SpongeBob attracted a seahorse from his garden and decided to keep it? That's stupid even for a children's cartoon. This episode is borderline D tier.
I agree with both of you on certain points. While the episode is a bit eccentric, I do think it has some good qualities. I like the implicit theme of not taking in an animal unless you have thoroughly thought through the consequences of owning said animal. I think a lot of people adopt animals with thinking about the long-term consequences of owning them, which is a mistake and ultimately bad for the animal involved, who has no choice in the matter. Let's stick this episode in B tier.
B tier sounds good to me, Joe. Next is a really good episode, Nasty Patty. I think this episode is incredible, definitely A tier in my book. The plot is fantastic, but I think the humor is too slapstick for my taste. What do you guys think?
I agree with you to an extent, Barack. The humor in this episode is far too childish for my liking. The idea of Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob accidentally killing a health inspector for no reason is superficially funny, but executed poorly in my opinion. This episode has a lot of potential that is lost, B tier in my opinion. Still a solid episode, just not one of my favorites.
The fact that neither of you want to put this episode in S tier does so much damage to your credibility as SpongeBob critics. This episode has everything an S tier episode should have. It has an absolutely hysterical plot with plenty of funny moments intertwined. It also has a deeper meaning about not being presumptuous and being honest when you make a mistake, and how lying can cause you to dig a bigger hole for yourself that gets deeper each time you tell a lie. Maybe Donald should watch this episode. After all, he promised Americans he would build a wall on the southern border, and I don't see one over 7 years later.
Joe, that wall would have been built if I won my second election.
That's funny. I can't seem to remember why you lost your second presidential election. Could you remind me who beat you?
You know you stole it from me, you old bat.
Donald, the wall is a pretty stupid idea. After all, most illegal immigrants from Latin American countries illegally immigrate through airplanes, which a wall obviously would not stop.
That might be true, but it is not a good reason to not build the wall. The more illegals we can keep out of the country, the better.
This is getting too political. I am sticking this episode in A tier towards the high end, and we are moving on. All right, my dudes, next episode is New Student Starfish. This is a really solid episode. I love the theme of not letting your friends drag you away from success. It is okay to have friends that are cut-ups, but don't let them stop you from achieving greatness. This is an A tier episode in my book.
I'm not sure A tier is appropriate for this episode. I think B tier is a better spot. The episode is pretty funny, and I like the dual theme of not giving in to peer pressure, but also working with your enemies for a greater good. That said, the episode's themes feel commonplace and stale. I have seen similarly structured episodes in many other shows.
This episode is pretty bad, TBH. The theme of working together and not giving in to peer pressure is okay, I guess, but I think this episode illustrates that Patrick is a garbage human being who will drag Spongebob down no matter what the situation.
You mean like when me and Joe were in office together?
What the hell, Barack?
Sorry, Joe Donald brings out the worst in me.
I'd say I just brought out the best in you, Barack.
Yeah, okay, sure. Anyway, I think we all can settle on this episode going in B tier. Up next is an all-time classic episode with no weenies allowed. This is the episode where Spongebob, despite his best efforts, cannot get into the salty spittoon and ends up at Weenie Hut Juniors as well as Super Weenie Hut Juniors. I love everything about this episode, especially the theme of masculinity being more than being tough. You can be a man without being a tough guy. This is something that comes up constantly throughout many SpongeBob episodes, and this episode portrays SpongeBob battle with masculinity better than most. High A tier in my book.
Barack, this episode is insanely overrated. You claim there is a theme of SpongeBob's battle with masculinity, but I would say that is just an aspect of the episode rather than a lesson. I do think the episode has some super funny moments, but they are few and far between. For the most part, it feels like pointless nonsense. What is the theme of this episode exactly? Don't slip on ice cubes. I think high B tier is a better spot for this.
Joe, that was the worst take I have ever heard come out of your mouth, and I never want to hear you utter such complete nonsense ever again. This episode is fabulous on all fronts, especially the humor department. My God, this episode is hilarious. So many hysterical moments, like when SpongeBob beats up Patrick, or Patrick beats up SpongeBob, or when the tough guy claims he ate a whole bowl of nails for breakfast without any milk. S tier for sure. This is a marvelous episode.
I think S tier is a bit generous, Donald, but it can be our highest A tier episode. Up next is One Crab's Trash. I think this episode should actually be called One Crab's Treasure because this shit is absolute gold. I love this episode with a white-hot, burning, fiery passion. It should be an S tier for how hilarious it is on its own. This episode brings me back to the good old days of 2010 of watching YouTube poop in my mom's basement, playing Minecraft, and not having to worry about anything at all.
Yeah, Barack, you are spot on with this episode. Not the most compelling plot, but this episode's humor alone is enough to carry it all the way up to S tier. I get cravings for this episode. Sometimes I watch it by myself when my wife goes to sleep.
Hey, Joe, you know what else your wife watches when you go to sleep?
I don't know what.
I don't know either, but she probably binge watches entire seasons of whatever show she is interested in at that moment while you're asleep for several days at a time, Sleepy Joe.
I hate you, Donald.
The feeling is mutual. Anyway, One Crab's Trash is an incredible episode. This episode is loaded with compelling themes such as not disrespecting the deceased, not scamming people, and studying the value of something before you sell it. I love the business lessons taught throughout this episode. It makes me eager to see what future generations will do with the lessons learned throughout this episode.
Good deal, fellas. Let's stick this in S tier and keep chugging along. Up next is Party Pooper Pants. This episode is objectively bad. It gives off some season 4 vibes, which is definitely not a compliment to this episode. I think the writers have trouble with longer episodes. The 11-minute runtime seems to be where they are at their best. This episode is very boring and forgettable. I would put it in the lower end of C tier.
Yeah, you're spotted, Barack. This episode is absolutely fucking terrible. I detest every second of it. To make matters worse, it features my least favorite duo of complete morons, Potty the Parrot and Patchy the Pirate. These characters are absolutely pathetic, just like this episode. Strong D tier from me.
You guys are crazy. This episode deserves way more credit than both of you jokers are giving it. I think there are plenty of great moments throughout this episode, and I like lesson it teaches about not trying to control people while they are having a good time. A laissez-faire approach to event planning is always best.
Joe, I would say you have a pretty laissez-faire leadership style, considering you have not done jack shit since stealing the 2020 election from me.
Donald, I have had to do so much work cleaning up the fucking train wreck you left behind. Even after you left office, you are making headlines for your stupid bullshit that you pulled. 37 potential felony counts. My God, you are literally a criminal.
Those are just accusations. We both know I am innocent until proven guilty.
It's only a matter of time until you are found guilty, you hoodlum.
It's only a matter of time until you two old farts stop fighting. Joe, while I appreciate your dissenting opinion, but majority rules, me and Donald both agree this episode is trash. Thus it is going in C tier.
Whatever, both of you always turn these tier lists into complete and total dog shit anyway.
Speaking of dog shit, let's talk about Plankton's Army. I don't really like this episode and find it to be highly overrated. I hate the concept of a bunch of little green rednecks committing organized crime for the sole intent of earning root beer. I also find the ending of this episode unbelievably cringe-inducing. D tier in my opinion, but what do you guys think?
Barack, you have lost a lot of brain power since serving as the president.
That implies he ever had any...
Shut up, Donald. Anyway, Plankton Army is a classic, memorable episode, and that is for a reason. It is a rare instance where we get a glimpse into Plankton's personal life, and to my knowledge, it is the first time where he is ever referred to as Sheldon, which is one of the funniest recurring tropes the show has to offer. I think A tier is a better spot for this episode.
I hate to say it, but I think Joe has the right take on this episode. It is a mid-episode, definitely overrated, but it is not bad in any way. I think B tier is the right spot for this episode. I like the idea of Plankton being an evil genius, despite his family being a bunch of dumb rednecks. That is so ironic and hilarious.
Does Plankton's family remind you of your supporters, Donald?
If you're implying that Plankton's family is a bunch of hardworking, honest Americans, then yes, Joe, that would be correct.
Joe, you shouldn't stereotype the tens of millions of people who voted for Donald. That would be next to impossible. I'll stick this episode in B tier and we can keep going. On deck is Pranks a Lot, a classic episode where Spongebob and Patrick use invisible spray to spook the entire town of Bikini Bottom. I like this episode a lot. The humor is a little too childish and slapstick for my tastes, but I like the theme of not taking pranks too far, even if they are fun for you. B tier for me, what do you guys think?
Yeah, this episode is all right. Not the best, but not the worst. Pretty average episode. I like the ending where Mr. Krabs is shown to be a total coward in the face of the supernatural, but still ends up on top. The irony is juicy and hysterical. I think this is a lower-end A-tier episode.
I think this is a nice episode. Watching SpongeBob and Patrick get publicly humiliated after wreaking havoc on all of Bikini Bottom was one of my favorite revenge moments from the entire series. B tier is a good spot for this one.
Okay, then I'll stick this bad boy in B tier and we can move on. Gentlemen, let's take a quick break to thank Chime Bank. Chime Bank is a digital banking platform that offers online-only banking services. It operates primarily through its mobile app, providing users with convenient and accessible banking features. Chime Bank aims to make banking simpler and more transparent, with a focus on providing a user-friendly experience and avoiding many of the fees associated with traditional brick-and-mortar banks.
Wow, Barack, Chime Bank sounds absolutely incredible.
Well, guess what, Donald? It gets even better. Chime has a great referral program going on right now where you can make $100 by direct depositing $200 into your new zero fees Chime checking account.
Wow, $100? Sign me up.
Wow, even as a billionaire, I recognize that this is a great investment. Making $100 from $200 is a 50% return on your investment. Absolutely incredible. Barack, how can I take advantage of this great offer?
You can use the link in the description to sign up with Chime and make $100 and also support this channel. Thank you very much, Chime Bank. Let's get back to our tier list. Next EP is Rockabye Bivalve, the episode where SpongeBob and Patrick decide to become a mother and father for a baby clam. I think this episode is very good, but a little bit overrated. I like the deeper concept that the episode portrays by challenging motherly and fatherly stereotypes in the show. That is a fantastic message for kids to receive when watching this. The episode is also quite funny. I think this is a strong A-tier episode.
Nah, Barack, this is an S-tier episode. Every minute of this episode is downright hilarious. The thought of SpongeBob and Patrick being in a homoerotic relationship while nurturing a clam is a hysterical concept that is executed to a T in this episode. I think SpongeBob and Tom Kenny are at their best when SpongeBob gets pissed off. And boy, do we see SpongeBob's angry side in this episode. This is an exemplary S-tier episode.
You guys are not thinking this through on a high enough level. This episode is incredibly overrated, and let me explain why. The whole joke of the episode is, haha, two buddies, SpongeBob and Patrick, are gay and have a baby clam. The joke gets old after about 5 seconds. On top of that, I am very annoyed with how this episode portrays fathers. It makes the audience think that all fathers are bums who contribute nothing to a family, when in reality this is merely an exception to the rule. My father, Fred Trump, was an unbelievable man who made me the man I am today.
If that's the case, I think Fred Trump should have made your mom swallow the night you were conceived.
Joe, that's nasty, bro. Donald, I see your point, but I still think this episode is way too good to keep it out of the higher part of A tier, which is exactly where it is going. With that out of the way, let's talk about Snowball Effect. This is a bland, forgettable episode, one of the worst Season 3 has in the catalog. I think the highlight of this episode is the breathtaking animation, but otherwise it is subpar, C tier to me.
Yeah, this episode is pretty bad, Barack. Typical Squidward torture porn stuff right here. Seeing Bikini Bottom in a winter environment is pretty cool, something that is very uncommon throughout the entire series, but this episode is simply not that good. I would take your rating a step further and put this in D tier.
You two buffoons are back at it again with the bad takes. Putting this episode in the lower tiers is appalling, and I will not stand for that. This episode is great. It is unique because of the snow aesthetic. It has great writing and jokes. I know the eye-rolling nature of episodes where SpongeBob and Patrick annoy Squidward gets old after a while, but this episode is an exception to that general rule. I think it should be in B tier.
Sorry, Joe, but the fact of the matter is that this episode fucking sucks.
Yeah, Joe, this episode is straight doo-doo, but of course you like it. Anyone with a single-digit IQ would love this complete and total dribble.
Donald, let's not be too mean to Joe. That said, I am going to stick this episode in C tier. While it is not a great episode, I would still watch it. In my mind, an episode should only be in D tier if it is unwatchable. I am not sure this season has an episode that is that bad.
Personally, I would have this episode and a few others on our list in D tier, but I can live with this one being in C tier.
That's great, Donald. Let's talk about our next episode, SpongeBob Meets the Strangler. I love the premise of this episode. There is a guy who is so adamant about snitches getting stitches that he literally strangles anyone who snitches on him. He is so feared that even the likes of Larry the Lobster and Mr. Krabs tremble in fear at the mere mention of his name. I think this is an A-tier quality episode.
I agree with you, Barack. This is simply a really good episode. I love the scene where SpongeBob is wearing cleats and mutilates the Strangler's eyeballs. That is some classic SpongeBob shit right there. A-tier is where this episode should be.
I think this episode says a lot about our criminal justice system. The fact that someone like the Tattletale Strangler would literally rather be in jail than associate with SpongeBob is hard-hitting and says a lot about how generous we are to our prisoners. We should be tougher on crime.
Hey, Donald, I'm glad you feel that way, but this is a SpongeBob tier list, not an interview with Fox News.
Barack, fuck you. I am trying to make a point about the episode and you are stealing my thunder. Anyway, I really like this episode. It has several funny moments. The theme is a little hokey, but overall quality stuff. I think it should be high B tier, maybe lower A tier.
I'll put it in A tier since we all seem to be okay with that. Next, we have SpongeGuard on Duty, the infamous episode where SpongeBob decides he wants to become a lifeguard. I think this is a wonderful episode. This is a classic episode where we see SpongeBob fight against traditional masculine values. He wants to be a tough, sexy lifeguard, but that is not who he really is. He ends up paying a huge price for this when he almost kills his best friend. This episode is A tier.
I am not crazy about this episode. I don't like that Patrick ends up getting punished by Larry despite doing nothing wrong. SpongeBob is clearly the one who needs punishment. I also don't like the implication that women are only interested in lifeguards. Clearly they are more interested in incredibly wealthy businessmen like me. D tier episode in my opinion.
Nah, Donald, you're wildin' right now. This episode is awesome. I love that this whole episode starts because SpongeBob is struck by a falling ice cream truck. I also love this episode's moral that you should not fake credentials to earn a job. It reminds me a lot of when you were elected to President Donald. Clearly you were in way over your head and did a terrible job, just like SpongeBob trying to be a lifeguard.
Joe, I was an incredible president, and you know it. My credentials are not important because the good people of America elected me. They know best after all.
And your dreams, bro. Barack, I think this episode is B tier.
B tier works. Let's move on. Up next is Squilliam Returns. This episode is criminally underrated, one of the most underrated gems in the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob. I love everything about this episode. I love the theme, the animation, music, jokes. Everything is awesome. I think this is an A-tier episode.
Barack, this episode is low-key for a reason. It is average at best. Sure, the ending where SpongeBob has a manic episode because he became a fancy waiter in less than 20 minutes is a great individual scene, but other than that, this episode is dry and bland. Squilliam as a character leaves a lot to be desired. He is just a reskin of Squidward that is incredibly rich and successful but offers nothing else to the show. The episode is not bad, but you are hyping it up way too much. I think it belongs in B tier.
Joe, per usual, you are 100% wrong. Barack, you actually made some solid points. Joe Squilliam is a side character. You do understand that means his personality should not be fully developed, right? His purpose is to be a rich prick with no actual backstory. That is how he develops the plot of the episodes he is in.
Squilliams must remind you of yourself, Donald, a rich prick.
You are correct, Joe. Squilliam does remind me of myself. You actually remind me a lot of Squidward because I will always be way more rich and successful than you could ever hope to be. You will always live in my shadow.
Hey, Donald, I am glad you get off on boasting about yourself, but can you get to the point and tell the good people how you feel about this episode?
Yeah, sure, Barack. This episode is extremely underappreciated. I also think it should be an A tier. I love the scene where we see the inner machinations of SpongeBob's mind. That was an extremely clever and hilarious analogy by the writers.
Good man, Donald. I will put this in A tier. Up next is The Algae's Always Greener. This is the episode where Plankton switches lives with Mr. Krabs only to find that everything is not sunshine and rainbows like he had anticipated. I love the overall moral of this episode that someone's life on the surface is not nearly as great as their day-to-day reality. Most people think being the president is great and luxurious, but in reality, it is a lot of hard work and sacrifice. I think this is a B-tier episode.
Yeah, I think this episode is pretty good. I bet Joe would want to trade lives with me just to know what it's like to be a productive president.
Maybe I would trade lives with you if I wanted to be charged with 37 felonies.
That doesn't nullify my point about you wishing you were as good of a president as me. Anyway, I think this episode is pretty good. I think the premise is creative and the jokes are pretty funny. I would stick it in A tier.
I think A tier is a little too generous for this episode. Sure, seeing an episode with an alternative dimension is entertaining, and I will give the writers credit for not making the episode too absurd, but I think it is not good enough to stand with our other A-tier episodes. It can be in the higher end of B-tier, though.
That's great analysis, Joe. B-tier it is. Up next is The Bully, the episode where Flats the Flounder moves into town and threatens to quote-unquote kick SpongeBob's butt for no apparent reason. I gotta be honest, guys, I do not care for this episode. I like that SpongeBob ultimately gets the best of Flats, who is a huge bully and deserves everything that happened to him in this episode, but I am not sure what the point of the episode is. SpongeBob gets in trouble for being in the wrong place at the wrong time at the end of the episode, but he literally did nothing wrong and gets threatened by his teacher instead. I also hate that when SpongeBob goes to a trusted adult, Mrs. Puff, to confide in her his tough situation, it ultimately makes things worse. That is a terrible lesson to teach children. I understand the episode is a bit of a joke, but I don't find it all that funny. C tier for me.
Barack, you need to take a chill pill, bro. Sure, the lessons learned from the episode are not the most beneficial for the youth, but the episode is very funny. We see Flats ultimately physically bested by SpongeBob, who is undoubtedly a wimp. On top of that, there are so many hilarious scenes throughout this episode, like the ending or when Flats rips out his chest hair. I think this is at least B tier.
Yeah, Barack, you are being way too serious right now, bro. I get what you were saying, but this is an entertainment show, not an educational program. If kids wanted to actually learn something, they could watch the Discovery Channel. I think the episode is very funny, and I like that in the end, the bully got what he deserved. Could the writers have been more clever in making sure the episode was ultimately productive for children to watch? Sure, but that does not deteriorate the overall quality of the episode, which I would slot into B tier.
I disagree with both of you, but respect your opinions enough that I will stick this in B tier. Up next is another episode that I am not a big fan of, the camping episode. The episode compositely is not so bad, but good God, do I absolutely detest the campfire song. I loved it as a kid, but as I grew older and heard it more and more in cringy internet memes and videos, I grew to resent it. I think this whole episode is a total mess. The story is preposterous, the song is abysmal, and this episode is a little too close to the unfortunate Squidward torture porn trend that would start in the later seasons. I would put this episode in C tier.
Barack, while I agree the song in this episode is tantamount to pouring lava in my ears, I think C tier is way too low for this episode. So many hysterical scenes in just this one episode. I get that the whole trope of SpongeBob and Patrick putting Squidward through hell gets old after a while, but this episode does have some funny moments, like when Squidward tries to razz SpongeBob and Patrick by attracting a sea bear to show how stupid they are acting, only to get viciously attacked by one. I think B tier is a better spot for this episode.
Yeah, B tier is a good spot for this episode. It is not a bad episode, but probably the most overrated in the SpongeBob franchise. I do think it has some moments that warrant laughter, but overall it's pretty bland and superficial.
B tier it is. Let's discuss the Great Snail Race. Unlike the last two episodes, I fuck with this episode. I think this episode should be S tier. I love the message this episode has about overworking yourself. I love everything about this episode except the ending where Rocky somehow magically wins the snail race. Other than that, this episode is nearly flawless.
Barack, that ending scene where Rocky somehow wins the race despite being a rock is downright hilarious. You are so uptight sometimes. I think the ending scene where no one can spell Squidward's name correctly is classic. I think this episode is absolutely wonderful. I am not sure it should be an S tier, but definitely in the higher part of A tier.
This episode is fantastic. While I disagree with the premise that working yourself too hard will lead to destruction, I understand what the episode is trying to portray. Maybe the average person cannot work themselves to death, but it makes a guy like me stronger. I thrive off of work, but I guess Gary the Snail could not handle it. I agree with the A-tier ranking. This episode is very funny and the writing is very clever. I do like that it shows why you should not compare people, as it can ruin someone's ego.
I will put it in A tier to make both of you happy.
That's epic because that is exactly where it belongs, Barack.
Getting into our final three episodes, boys. The Sponge Who Could Fly is absolute garbage. I hate this episode. This is one of those episodes where we can see season 4 starting to creep in. This episode makes me sad. It makes me realize that SpongeBob, after season 3, became a shell of its former self that has never fully recovered since its glory days. I think this is a C-tier episode, maybe the worst episode of the season.
Obama putting this pathetic episode in C tier is way too generous. This episode is terrible in every way. It is unfunny, has a terrible plot, and stretches on for an almost unwatchable 22 minutes. This trash should be in D tier, and you know it.
Donald D tier is a bit extreme. Like we said earlier, only episodes that are unwatchable should be in D tier. This episode is not good by any stretch of the imagination, but it has a few quality moments.
Joe, can you name any of those quality moments?
Well, I can't think of any at the top of my head, but I am sure if we watched it together, you would see what I mean.
Wow, Joe, that was quite the compelling argument.
Anyway, I don't like that this episode starts the unfortunate trend in the newer seasons of SpongeBob not having a backbone. I think it should be in C tier, probably the worst episode of the season.
Agreed. Next is another bad episode. It sucks that the last few episodes we are rating are pretty bad, but it is what it is. I think the writers struggled with the longer episodes and is a great example of that. For anyone who does not remember, is the caveman episode where we see a prehistoric version of Bikini Bottom. I think the episode is an interesting concept, but not executed at a very high level. I would put this in C tier, not the worst episode in the season, but definitely one of the worst.
Agreed, Obama. Ironically, I think this episode was written by cavemen given how lowbrow it is. I hate everything about this episode. It features Potty and Patchy, who to no one's surprise add absolutely nothing of value to an already bland episode. The lack of legitimate dialogue in the episode really takes the writers out of their element. They need spoken words to communicate humor effectively. This is a lower C-tier episode.
Come on, guys, this episode deserves better than C tier. We get to see what I believe are the great ancestors of SpongeBob, Squidward, and Patrick interact with one another. The song When Worlds Collide at the end of this episode is simply epic. I love the slapstick humor this episode utilizes as well. I think this is a B-tier episode.
Joe, this is a C-tier episode, and you are a C-tier president.
You are an S-tier president if S stood for sexual predator.
You are both F-tier presidents. This episode obviously belongs in C tier, Joe. The only reason you like it is because it reminds you of your childhood.
Sick burn, Barack.
Thanks, Donald. That means a lot coming from you. All right, gentlemen, we are ending on a strong note with Wet Painters. This is clearly an S-tier episode. Everything about it is incredible. The buildup of the episode is marvelous, and watching SpongeBob and Patrick go through the entire possible spectrum of emotions while trying to figure out how to paint Mr. Krabs' basement is hilarious. The ending is a bit ridiculous, but I can live with that. This is an S-tier episode on the lighter end.
I agree, Barack. This episode is magnificent. So many memorable, hilarious moments pickled throughout this episode. It is a great watch from front to back. This is by far one of my most favorite episodes of SpongeBob. Easy S tier.
I think the episode is pretty good and has plenty of funny moments, but not sure that alone warrants S tier. Sure, the episode is hysterical, but what is the deeper meaning of this episode? The episode as a whole feels like random comedy with no greater purpose or meaning. That is fine, but if I am going to put an episode in S tier, I want everything from comedy to deeper philosophical principles in an episode. I would put this in high A tier.
Donald, you are such a fucking hater. This is an S tier episode. You just want to drag out this tier list, so we keep hanging out with you because you have no other friends.
That's not true. I have plenty of friends.
Name one.
You probably wouldn't know them.
I thought you only hung out with young, hot celebrities.
Exactly. You're so out of touch you would have no idea who any of these people are, Joe.
Donald, it's okay to admit we are your only friends. There is no shame in that. Regardless, I think we have a pretty good tier list.
You guys always ruin these things. If I did one on my own, it would be so much better.
Maybe if your audience was primarily composed of low IQ morons, then yeah, you would have a magnificent tier list, Joe.
Fuck off, Donald. Anyway, guys, I gotta go. I have a physical therapy appointment.
What an old coot. Only old people have physical therapy appointments.
What about young people who have injuries?
They're just soft. Anyway, Barack, I gotta go get ready for some legal stuff. I'll catch you around though.
Those guys are schmucks anyway. For anyone still watching this, make sure to smash that motherfucking like button as hard as you can. Also, make sure to leave a comment if you disagree with any of our rankings. You can also use the links in the description to support this channel and yourself. Whether it's signing up with Chime to earn $100 with a new checking account bonus, or signing up with Swag Bucks to earn money from taking surveys and finding online shopping discounts, you will be greatly supporting this channel. I love you all. Thank you for watching and have a great night.